Hi, everybody. I'm Diane Brady. I'm here with Keith Ferrazzi, who is an executive team coach. He's an author. He's a contributor to Forbes, and he is, of course, the founder and chairman of Ferrazzi Greenlight. Keith, always good to see you.
And don't forget, longtime friend of Diane Brady.
Longtime friend of mine, and somebody for whom I go to you quite a bit for counsel on a lot of different issues around leadership. You've pointed me to some really good stories in the past. And when I was looking at all of the dysfunction in Congress right now, I thought, what lessons can we draw from this? You've written a bit about it. I don't know if anybody faces quite the same situation, but what are you thinking as you look at this mess?
You know, there's a phrase, I was listening to the news this morning, and with all of the shadow side skullduggery and the conversations in the corridors, etc., while I wouldn't say that anybody has to deal with that kind of BS in most corporations, that there's a lot of similarity to what we all have to deal with in our corporations. And the greatest line that I thought of this morning was, sunlight is the greatest disinfectant. And when I'm working with an executive team or a major transformation in an organization, one of the most important things that I'm trying to help a team achieve is a recognition that the wisdom of the crowd exists, that leadership is not about holding information and coming up with brilliant insights as a leader. Yeah. Real leadership is an appreciation for diversity and inclusion of ideas, wrestling things in the open, having the wisdom of the crowd watching what's really going on, so that, in a sense, not consensus, but the democracy can prevail. And I use that word specifically, while I don't use it in corporations very much, I use it here. Because wouldn't it be amazing if the bullshit that's actually being spoken right now in those corridors down in DC was forced to be published?
We could hear it.
What if we could hear it?
Well, transparency often goes with trust. I guess transparency can certainly breed trust. Is one of the major issues you're talking about is this disconnect between what's said behind closed doors and promised and what actually plays out when people sort of get into the sunlight of Congress and those votes?
You went right to the core issue, which is why I have such respect for you. You went right to the core issue, which is this trade-off between candor and transparency and trust and relationship. There's two ways to go about doing that. If I were to walk into an organization and to help an organization achieve the kind of psychological safety that can have these transparent wrestling debates that that everybody sees and therefore breaks through to real innovative thinking, there's two ways to get it. One is you can agree to a social contract like Ray Dalio does, that everybody hired here will have this degree of transparency or you're out. Everybody hired here will be critical of each other for the sake of a better outcome, right? Or you're out. And that's one solution. But unfortunately, I have the need to walk into an organization that has been around for 100 years and try to get that has old social contract, old agreements of ways of working, which might include the back channel conversation, which actually is the way they get stuff done. And then sometimes you do have to bring relationship to the forefront and actually create some empathy among people. I wrote an article when the Biden administration was stepping into power, and it was really about, if I were running the cabinet, if I were coaching the cabinet, how would I think about moving relationship forward in the cabinet amongst each other? Because, by the way, the cabinet looks like a lot of executive teams, very hub and spoke to the president, to the leader. They're not actually interdependent. They're not bulletproofing or stress testing each other's ideas. And the other thing,
should they be? You think they should be?
I think they should be. In government, 100%. I wrote this piece just like I said, when Biden was stepping in, because look, you're dealing with some of the smartest people in your organization, and if you don't use your executive team meetings to bulletproof and stress test each other, I call it, there's actually, and I would recommend that we learn from here, we take a thread of work on. In this case, it's the presumption that we're going to come up with a new speaker, or in the case of an organization, product, or it could be how we're going to deal with AI, etc. And we take an assumption one of the executives may have, and put out there in very public format to the top executives. But along with it, and I would even say, don't use meetings as the primary form of this collaboration. You and I have talked a lot about how we're not recreating work for a hybrid world. We're still crawling back in meeting-based collaboration in physical world. If you put a point of view out to the world and say, here's how all 12 of the executives think about this issue. Here's what each one thinks the problem is. Here's what each one thinks the solution is. And we were to read that information very publicly, very transparently, what would emerge from that is a much better agenda for the meeting that we need to have, a much better and clearer articulation of the problem. And what would emerge is the sub-meetings that really do need to happen to land the plane. I call that meeting shift. And I wrote that, I talked about that in your Future of Work Summit. I wrote an article in Forbes on meeting shifting. And the transparency of this way of collaborating and the fact that people get to be contemplative and thoughtful and not just forced to answer in a meeting where not everybody performs the best in that format, right? You start to bring transparency. And the other thing, the people who might be inclined to lobby behind the scenes, they're forced to put it out there in the open. And and then
No, go ahead. I mean, I guess one thing that strikes me as interesting is in some ways I think about the power of partnership and then what happens within a corporation. One of the unique aspects of Congress, of course, is that the hiring managers are all different. You know, if you come from a red state, you have a certain, degree of expectations to who your boss is versus a blue state, et cetera. So in a way, they're kind of coming to the table like a lot of different companies coming together as opposed to people in one company. I don't know if that's a fair analogy, but do you think that the lessons are equally valid for that scenario of, in essence, dealing with partners?
I thought through how long this analogy that we would play with for this interview, how long it would last. And where I think it falls apart is exactly what you're talking about. Because the reality is, and this does exist in corporations, where you've got a corporation and the mission and the vision of the corporation is different from the product side than from the sales side.
Yeah.
So you do have situations where we lack alignment. And that's one of the things I try to do, and I pull it together at the executive team level. We've got to squeeze all the blood out of the discontent at that level so that we can find that alignment, right? And more importantly, at least we can find the areas of disagreement. And then it's up to the leader to say, you're either in this boat or you're out of the boat, meaning out of the corporation. If you're not, you can't continue to row in a different level. That's the place that breaks Congress, because you don't have a Republican Party, right? You have multiple parties right now who, you've got this group of 11, however many that group is. That's its own team with its own mission and its own objectives that have nothing to do with the primary Republican Party.
Before
you're working with two different organizations.
Before we move on, one of the things that fascinates me is why would anybody want to lead this chaos? Starting with, of course, Kevin McCarthy, who went through 15 rounds to get his job, which he's no longer in. In executive teams, you always deal with the people at the top. In this situation, I don't know if it's no win or not, but certainly that is the perception. Is it money and ego? Is there some other factor that drives people to want to be at the helm of these sorts of crazy groupings?
I think the answer is yes. It is money. Speaker fees today are very different than they were 2 months ago, right?
Right.
And
yes,
so yes. Is it ego? Yes. But is it? I do believe that people who are going for the gold ring, whether it's in a corporation, like a person was Mary Barra a no-win job?
Right.
Well, we look back now and say, of course, it wasn't a no-win job. But many people thought at the time, coming out of bankruptcy, trying to pay off the TARP money, all the positions that they were in, that there was no way that GM, the leader of GM, was a successful position to be in. I think people feel that they have a mission. I know Mary, Mark Royce, that team over there, they have a mission. They believe in the company and they believe what its importance for America. And they have a heritage. They have generations, literally, of their family that are behind it. So I think it's all of the above. I really do. I think you have to have a healthy ego. I think you have to appreciate what it does for you personally. But at the same time, I do think that they fundamentally believe that they could do something differently.
Yep. Let me, if you don't mind, Keith, I want to pivot a bit to other dysfunctional, or let's just call them divided teams right now, with the tragedy of what's happened in Israel, now with the war in Israel, Hamas. I mean, among other things, the protests have really sort of sparked further divisiveness. If you're a leader in this climate, what advice do you have, or managers, to people on teams where emotions are running high?
That's so beautiful. And I think the first thing we have to recognize is that that people are interpreting this very differently according to their own history, their own context, etc. And you just have to acknowledge that. You might think that there's only one way to look at the world, but the reality is the people that you're asking to be productive in your organization, they are all coming at this from slightly different perspectives, slightly different traumas, slightly different experiences. And I think instead of looking at what people's opinions are in that regard, I want us to shift the conversation for a second. And I want us to look at the energy of an individual. One of the things that we researched during the pandemic was how powerful it was in corporations when we showed up on our teams and we paused at the beginning, not because it was some exercise, but we paused at the beginning of meetings and said, is everybody okay? And we really
That's
meant
true.
that, right? And we really meant that. And we meant it even as far as, is your mom, who I know is at an assisted living facility, is she okay? And what we were asking is, we want to take care of each other's energy. How is each other? How are each other? And how is each other's energy? And I know, please don't excuse me for being from the West Coast and using the word energy in this regard. But
I believe it. You know, I remember in the aftermath of George. Yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. I'm sorry, but I was recalling in the aftermath of George Floyd's death, we were asking Black colleagues how they were feeling. This seems like a good analogy to that. You know, one of the things that strikes me as especially difficult right now is, I don't know, I think cancel culture is probably too cheap a term to phrase it, but this need for moral clarity, the backlash you've seen, certainly against universities when they haven't stood up and taken a stance as to setting the narrative, because both sides, there aren't necessarily fine people on both sides in this case, if you're thinking of Israel and Hamas in terms of their goals. How do you deal with that?
I mean, I think, first of all, we have to make the distinction between Hamas and Palestinians. And I think that, you know, that it's easy to take the moral high ground against the atrocities that were made. But again, I want to shift and suggest this moral high ground issue is a big issue. And I know CEOs who have been voraciously attacked, and literally from all sides. Literally, and many of the CEOs are saying there is no winning for me taking a stance on this particular issue, which is, and I would suggest you really need to look into your own soul and your own heart and vote with your values and who you are. But I still think that the one truism of you are responsible for the energy of your associates, and they have different points of view. You're coming into an election process and you have people who are going to be voting for one party or the other party in your warehouses. And, you know, you have individuals who see not eye to eye on these very critical global issues, including what's going on with Ukraine and the Soviet Union and, I mean, Russia. So I think it's so important to keep your center of asking, how do I manage the energy of my people? And a part of it is asking that question. A very simple exercise I'll give you, and I've written about it in my Forbes columns, is an energy check-in. What if once a week you would let people go around, and this, I get this from watching other forms of peer-to-peer support, like AA programs. In an AA program, everybody goes around and they do a check-in of where they are. And yet you're not allowed crosstalk. It's not a time to be critical or to be an armchair therapist or to be a politician giving advice. You're just hearing where people are. And the intention is to let people know, what is my energy right now? And I would say, let people give a title, a 0 to 5. My energy is on 0 to 5, and why? And the why could be anywhere, and you'll start to hear some of this outpouring. And we all have to recognize that it's not our job to judge. where this person is and why. Our job is to hold space to help this person be at their most functional, positive energy. And sometimes it's letting them be, and other times it might be calling them afterward, giving them some consolation because their mom's sick, or that they're grappling with some messages they've been getting from a foreign country.
You know, as you're speaking, one thing comes to mind, especially in Silicon Valley. We've heard everybody from Mark Zuckerberg, Elon Musk on down talk about eliminating that useless level of middle management, they almost call it. And what you're talking about really is in some ways a testament to the power of managers in corporations and the role that people have. You quit your boss, you don't quit your job. Do you see any trends when you're looking at teams as to
I love this.
The structure?
I love this. You were in my head from some research we've been doing lately. I think you may recall when my friend Tony Hsieh passed away, I started a award in his honor, finding other innovators who are out there doing radical things in human capital, like Tony Hsieh did at Zappos for employee engagement. But one of the things Tony was playing with very early on was holacracy, which is self-managed teams. And I thought it was silly, the idea you wouldn't have managers for teams. But what I found is now over the last couple of years, we've had hundreds of entrepreneurs who have negotiated with their work teams a social contract among the team, so that instead of the leader being responsible for giving each other feedback, the team gave each other feedback. Instead of the leader responsible for holding each person accountable, the team held each other accountable. And if you think about holacracy on one end of the extreme, self-management, and on the other end of the extreme, you think about a control-oriented, old GE style, team,
right?
Command and control. In the middle is empowerment, right? And this principle of teamship over leadership is emerging. And I do think that a more holacratic, and then you start to add technology tools like dashboards that AI will be able to produce, team members that are AI related. I think we're going to start to see management able to free itself up from some of the archaic things that it used to do and really be more strategic. And frankly, at some point in some organizations, may even change the social contract so teams are much more self-managed than they ever were before. But that's going to be a real shift, because you can't have the cultures that we have today are not supportive of a holacratic culture. You have command, you control, you have authority, etc.
I want to have you back again and again for conversations. I'd be remiss not to end with, I first met you when you did your book, Never Eat Lunch Alone. I'm always curious about the habits of successful people. You've mentioned some of them here, of course. Are there other habits that you think about right now that really give you energy?
I would say the biggest habit that I think most, and I wrote this in Competing in the New World of Work, we had 2,000 teams, only 15% during the pandemic really reinvented the way they worked. Most shifted the way they worked into a virtual environment, and now they're rushed back. Big awakening is what I talked about. You can find it at Forbes.com. Was the use of non-meeting based collaboration. Shift away from meetings as your primary form of collaboration. It is faster. You get more inclusive and bolder ideas, and you have a resilience of the team that isn't droning on in these incessant meetings that we're in. And so I would say the new tip that I would give for a high performing leader is to start to use asynchronous collaboration and the tools of collaboration more, as opposed to thinking that meetings are the primary form of collaboration.
From your mouth to the ears of everyone in Congress, here's hoping. As always, it's a pleasure, Keith, and I look forward to continuing the conversation.
Me too, Diane. Thanks a lot for having me as a contributor.
Thank you.